When 18-year-old Sipho defied the sacred curfew of Marula Ridge, he knew the risks. He knew the night belonged to the spirits, but with his mother dying of a supernatural lung rot, desperation drove him straight into the forbidden thornveld, straight into the midnight market. He survived the shadows, he avoided the traps, but at the very edge of the bazaar, he stood before the most dangerous entity of all, an ancient trader whose voice carried a terrible double echo, as if two people were speaking the exact same words at slightly different times. The trade is on the table. The price of his mother's life is about to be revealed, and the dark entities of the bushveld are waiting for him to make one single mistake. Welcome back to Silver Phoenix African Tales. Dim your lights, brace yourself, because tonight we finish the trade.
I am looking for a trader,
Sipho said, his voice cracking. He remembered the rule. He had not spoken until now. You have found one, she said, pausing her grinding. She reached up with a long skeletal hand. Her fingernails were long, thick, and black as charcoal, and tilted her head up. Sipho gasped. Where her eyes should have been, there were two polished discs of silver. They didn't reflect the green light of the fireflies. They reflected him. In the silver of her left eye, he saw himself standing in the clearing. In the silver of her right eye, he saw his mother, gasping for her final breaths in the dark bedroom. You seek the life water, she stated, not asking. The fluid from the roots of the first tree, the only thing that can wash the dust out of a mortal's lungs.
Yes,
Sipho whispered.
Please.
The old woman reached beneath the granite slab. When her hand returned, she was holding a small, pear-shaped gourd. It was translucent, made of a material that looked like dried skin but was clear as ice. Inside, a thick, viscous blue liquid shifted and turned, casting a soft, cool light over her wrinkled chin. It looked like a piece of the winter sky trapped in wood. The life water, she said, holding it between two bony fingers. It does not fail. 3 drops on the tongue before the sun touches the hills, and the lungs will become like a newborn babe's. The sickness will leave, and she will walk the earth for another 20 summers. Sipho reached out for it, but the old woman pulled the gourd back with a speed that was terrifying. Ah, she clicked her tongue. The market has laws, boy. We do not give, we exchange. What have you brought to buy your mother's 20 summers? Sipho took a deep breath. He reached into his denim jacket and pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch. He laid it gently on the black granite slab. The watch was large and heavy. The silver plating was worn away at the edges, showing the dull yellow brass beneath, but it was polished until it shone. On the back, an old inscription was faintly visible, carved by a rough hand. J. Kumalo, Western Deep Levels, 1974. The old woman looked down at the watch. She didn't touch it at first. She leaned over it, sniffing the air like a dog. A machine of the white men. She spit into the dirt, her mouth twisting in disgust. What use have we for wheels and ticks? Time does not live here. We are the ones who outlived the clocks. It is not just a clock, Sipho said desperately, stepping closer to the table. It is my great-grandfather's. He wore it for 30 years in the deep mines of Johannesburg. He wore it when the rockfalls happened. He wore it when he breathed the gold dust that eventually killed him. It holds his time. It holds his sweat. The old woman stopped. Her silver eyes flared with a sudden intense brightness. She reached out and picked up the watch. The moment her black fingernails touched the metal, the watch began to tick. It hadn't ticked in 20 years, the mainspring was broken and the gears were rusted solid, but now it beat like a frantic heart. Tick, 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 tick. She pressed the watch against her ear, closing her eyes. A horrific, wide smile spread across her face, revealing gums that were black and smooth, with no teeth at all. "Ah," she whispered, and her voice now carried the distinct sound of hundreds of men singing traditional mining chants deep underground, the low, rhythmic shosholoza that echoed through the dark tunnels. "Yes, I can taste it. The dark air of the deep earth, the fear of the men in the cages, the long hours spent away from the sun. The sorrow of a man who died old before his time." She looked up at Sipho. "The watch is old metal," she said, "but the memory inside it, the memory of 30 years of stolen sunlight, that has weight. It is a good trade." She set the translucent gourd down on the granite slab and slid it toward him. "Take it," she said. "But remember the law of the market. Once the trade is sealed, the market is closed to you. You must leave immediately. Do not speak to anyone on the path, and whatever you do, do not look back." Sipho snatched the gourd, feeling its strange, vibrating warmth through the thin skin. He shoved it deep into his inside jacket pocket, right next to his chest. "Thank you," he said. The old woman did not answer. She had already picked up her stone pestle and resumed her grinding. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Sipho turned on his heel and began to walk away from the stall. The moment his back was turned to the old woman, the character of the market shifted. The low hum of the crowd turned into a sharp, piercing hiss. The green fireflies began to drop from the sky like falling stones, extinguishing themselves as they hit the sand. The stalls were dissolving into grey mist, and the entities that inhabited them were moving into the central aisle, crowding the path behind him. Sipho did not run. He remembered his grandfather's second rule: walk home, do not look back. He marched down the darkening avenue, his eyes fixed on the distant black wall of the baobab trees that marked the entrance to the clearing. The air was freezing now. The cold crept through his jacket, through his shirt, turning his skin into goose flesh. A tall figure wrapped in jackal fur stepped into his path. Sipho didn't look at its face. He veered to the left, his shoulder brushing against the freezing, oily fur of the creature's cloak. A sensation like an electric shock ran down his arm, but he kept his head down and his feet moving. "He has the sky water!" a voice hissed from the dark to his right. It was a wet, bubbling voice that sounded like a drowning man. "Give us a drop! Just one drop for my dry throat!" Sipho kept his mouth shut. He bit his inner cheek until he tasted copper, using the pain to keep from screaming. He reached the edge of the clearing. He stepped onto the white river sand path that led back to the village. The emerald light faded completely, leaving him in a darkness so absolute that he had to navigate by the feel of the sand beneath his boots. Behind him, the sound of the drums changed. The rhythm became chaotic, aggressive, like the sound of a stampeding herd of buffalo. The ground beneath his feet shook. He could hear the snapping of branches, the tearing of thorn bushes, and the heavy, wet breathing of something massive pursuing him down the narrow path. "Don't look back," he chanted in his mind. "Don't look back. Don't look back." He had been running for 20 minutes when the sound of the pursuit suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the drums. It was a dead, heavy silence that pressed against his ears like water at the bottom of a deep pool. The white sand path had ended, and he was back on the rough, rocky ground of the thornveld. He could feel the jagged twigs tearing at his jeans, but he couldn't see them. Then, from the darkness directly behind him, less than an arm's length away, he heard a sound that made his soul freeze. It was a cough. A wet, rattling, shallow cough that sounded like a shovel scraping through dry gravel. "Sipho!" The voice was weak, trembling, and saturated with pain. It was his mother's voice. "Sipho, my child, wait for me. Why are you running so fast?" Sipho stopped. His left foot was suspended in the air, his body leaning forward, but he couldn't bring himself to take the step. Tears well up in his eyes, hot and stinging against the freezing air. "Sipho, it hurts so much," the voice whimpered. "Sipho, it hurts so much," the voice whimpered. He could hear the sound of someone crawling through the dry leaves on their hands and knees, dragging their legs behind them. "The house caught fire, my boy. The flames, they are burning my skin. Why did you leave me in the dark?" Every instinct he had cultivated since he was a baby, every cultural law of respect, every ounce of love he held for the woman who had given him life, screamed at him to turn around. He needed to pick her up. He needed to carry her. How could he walk away while his mother burned in the dark? His right hand crept toward his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth glass of the gourd. "3 drops before the sun touches the hills," the old woman had said. Sipho closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's face as it had looked that afternoon, pale, exhausted, but peaceful in her resignation. She had told him not to waste the candle wax. She had told him to sleep. She would never ask him to risk his life in the bush. She would never complain about the pain. The thing behind him wasn't his mother. It was the market, trying to reclaim its trade. "You are not her," Sipho whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. He remembered the first rule: do not speak to anyone until you stand before a trader. But the trade was done. He had already broken the rule of silence by speaking to the old woman. But did the rule apply on the way back? He didn't know. He had to trust his heart. "Sipho!" The voice behind him suddenly changed. The maternal tenderness vanished, replaced by a harsh, grating screech that sounded like metal tearing metal. "Look at me! Look at what you left behind!" A cold, wet hand, a hand with 5 long skeletal fingers, settled onto his left shoulder. The coldness of it went straight through his jacket, numbing his collarbone. Trying to pry his body around by force, Sipho gritted his teeth. He let out a loud, defiant roar, gathered every ounce of strength in his legs, and leaped forward, tearing his shoulder out of the entity's grip. He ran blindly. He didn't care about the thorns that slashed his face or the rocks that bruised his feet through the soles of his boots. He simply ran toward the southern horizon. The darkness began to lift, not because the sun was rising, but because the sky was turning from pitch black to a deep, royal blue. The stars were fading. In the distance, through the grey mist of the early morning bushveld, he saw it. The single strand of rusted barbed wire hanging between 2 rotting wooden posts, the boundary of Marula Ridge. From somewhere inside the village, from the coop behind Tharbo's house, a sound broke through the morning air. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" The first cock crowed. Behind Sipho, a chorus of frustrated, high-pitched shrieks rose from the thornveld, a sound like hundreds of disturbed bats taking flight. The heavy breathing, the crawling sounds, and the freezing wind all rushed backward, receding into the deep bush like a wave pulling back into the ocean. Sipho reached the wire fence. He didn't try to climb over it this time. He threw his body under it, rolling through the dry dust and cow dung until he lay flat on his back on the gravel road of the village. The air was instantly warm. The smell of wood smoke and morning porridge was beginning to rise from the nearest houses. The sky in the east was turning a soft, pale pink. He lay there for a long time, his chest heaving, his face covered in scratches and sweat. He reached into his jacket. The gourd was still there. It was no longer glowing green or blue. It looked like an ordinary brown wooden container. But when he shook it, he could hear the thick liquid shifting inside. He scrambled to his feet and ran for home. Sipho burst through the front door of his homestead, slamming it behind him. He didn't lock it. The sun was up. The rules of the night were over. He rushed into his mother's bedroom. Baba Kumalo was already there, sitting on his low stool in the corner, his walking stick resting between his knees. He didn't say anything as Sipho entered. He simply nodded once, a slow, solemn movement of his head. Grace lay on the bed, her face almost completely grey now. Her chest barely moved. She was minutes away from the end. Sipho's hands were shaking so violently he could barely uncork the gourd. He had to use his teeth to pull the wooden stopper free. He leaned over his mother, gently pulling her lower lip down with his thumb. He tilted the gourd. One drop of thick, clear liquid fell onto her tongue. It didn't look blue anymore, but the moment it touched her skin, a faint, sweet smell of wild sage filled the small room. A second drop fell. A third. Sipho held his breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Grace's head rolled to the side, and her breathing stopped completely. Sipho felt his heart drop into a bottomless void. He had failed. He had traded his grandfather's memory for a jar of river water. Then, Grace let out a massive, sudden gasp. Her chest rose high, expanding farther than Sipho had seen it move in months. She coughed, a deep, dry cough, and a small cloud of black. Soot-like dust billowed from her mouth, disappearing into the morning air. As the dust cleared, the grey colour vanished from her skin. The rich mahogany warmth returned to her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she looked up at him with eyes that were clear, bright, and completely healthy. "Sipho," she said, her voice strong and steady. She sat up in bed, looking around the room as if she had just woken from a long afternoon nap. "Why are you looking at me like that? And why is your face covered in scratches?" Sipho couldn't speak. He threw his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder, weeping tears of pure relief. "I am fine, Mama," he sobbed. I had a long night." "You boys," she sighed, wrapping her arms around him and patting his back with hands that were warm and full of life. "Always running around in the bush when you should be sleeping." An hour later, after his mother had insisted on getting out of bed to brew a fresh pot of tea and make porridge for the family, Sipho stood by the kitchen window, looking out over the yard. The village was alive now. Women were walking down the paths with plastic buckets on their heads, laughing and greeting each other. Children were chasing each other through the dust with old wire cars. The modern world had returned. Sipho took a sip of his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his tired limbs. He felt a profound sense of peace, but he also felt something else, a cold, permanent weight in the back of his mind. He looked past the garden gate, past the water tank, toward the edge of the property where the gravel road gave way to the thornveld. Standing just beyond the fence, hidden beneath the shadow of a large marula tree, was a small figure wrapped in a faded leopard skin blanket. The sun was fully up, shining brightly on the grass. But the shadow beneath that tree remained dark as midnight. The figure tilted its head up. For a fraction of a second, the morning sun caught the face beneath the black scarf, and 2 polished discs of silver flashed in the light, reflecting the image of the house back at him. The old woman smiled her toothless smile, reached into her cloak, and pulled out an old silver-plated pocket watch. She held it up, clicked the top open, and then pointed a long, black-nailed finger toward Sipho. She was reminding him, the trade was done, but the market never truly leaves those who have walked its aisles. It would sit at the edge of the village, waiting through the hot summer days, waiting for the moon to turn red again. And waiting for the next desperate soul to walk past the barbed wire after 11 o'clock, Sipho set his tea down, drew the kitchen curtains tight against the sunlight, and walked away from the window. Sipho saved his mother. The grey left her skin, and the warmth returned to her chest. But as he stands in the safety of the morning sun, he knows the truth. Thank you for listening to tonight's tale. If the shadows didn't claim you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into African folklore, and leave a comment below. What would you trade at the midnight market? Stay safe out there in the dark. Until next time.